In this section of the lecture, I'm going to talk about two case studies of countries in Africa which have, in relative terms, been successful in developing. I'm going to talk about Botswana and Mauritius. And so, to start off with, here's a table which includes a little bit of comparative data on both those countries. First of all, it's important to note that both Botswana and Mauritius are relatively small countries on the scale of Africa. And if you look at this part or section of the lecture and think about, well, what are the lessons for general African development experience, it is important to keep in mind that we're talking about two relatively small countries out of an overall population of 850 million in sub-Saharan Africa. But it is the case that these two countries are relatively successful economically, having GNI, gross national income per capita, about 6.5 times that of the rest of Africa. They've grown more rapidly than the rest of Africa in the period from 1970. They rate more highly on the Human Development Index. They have higher levels of adult literacy. Mauritius has a life expectancy about 20 years higher than the African average. Botswana, it's about the same as the average because in Botswana there's been a high incidence of AIDS in the past 20 or so years. Here's where the two countries are. Mauritius, located off the east coast of Africa, off Madagascar, and Botswana here between South Africa, Namibia, and Zimbabwe. I'm going to start out by talking about Botswana and then move on to talk about Mauritius. And in each case, I'm going to start out by emphasising some of the factors that you might have thought would have predisposed the country to be a poor country. And I do that to emphasise the idea that we really do need to look at the experience of each country as an individual country, that we need our overall frameworks as a way of organising our thought. That's what we bring when we think about the experience of a country like Botswana, but we always have to be open to the actual experiences of that country. It also tells us that there's no one path to economic failure or economic development, that there's a diverse range of paths to economic development. Having said that, we will see that in both Botswana and Mauritius, a major theme that's emerged from the case studies that I'm going to talk about has been the importance of institutional quality in allowing them to overcome what otherwise might have been impediments to development. So Botswana, it's landlocked, which we've talked about as being a potential disadvantage. It's resource rich. 40% of its national GDP is accounted for diamonds, and we've talked about how, to a large extent, the African experience of resource abundance has been that it's been a negative influence on economic development, and part of Botswana is in the tropical region. So Botswana has a variety of what we might have thought of in terms of standard approaches to thinking about development as geographical impediments. Yet, as we saw on the table, it's been relatively successful. But, as I mentioned, it has had some problems, AIDS, relatively high levels of inequality, and unemployment. But nevertheless, successful enough in terms of measures like the HDI and gross national income to be looking at its experience and trying to understand its experience. This is wealth in Botswana. As I said, 40% of the GDP at some points coming from diamond mining activity. This example of open cut, large-scale diamond mine. So I'm going to ask a series of questions about each of the same series of questions about each of Botswana and Mauritius. The first question is, how did this happen? How did a country that seemingly has some geographic impediments become a relatively rich country? And the case study that I'm basing this part of this section of the lecture on is from Daron Acemoglu, Simon Johnson and James Robinson, their case study, An African Success Story, Botswana. And they argue there's almost complete agreement that Botswana achieved this spectacular growth performance because it adopted good policies. So how did it come to be that Botswana had good policies? Well, Acemoglu, Johnson and Robinson argue that it's because Botswana had, post-independence, relatively good institutions. What were those institutions? Well, there was a parliament created that was divided into two parts. A representative National Assembly, so there was a governing body that was representative of the society in Botswana, and there was, reflecting also the tribal origins of Botswanan society, a House of Chiefs, where the chiefs of each of the Tswana tribes, which are the tribal organisation in Botswana, were located. But in the case study, Acemoglu, Johnson and Robinson talk about the importance of the National Assembly being the primary policy-making body, and the House of Chiefs, its power being progressively emasculated, so that rather than having a parliament which was based on tribal organisation and interests, that approach or that influence on policy making was small and largely diminished over time. And so policy making basically came from a representative National Assembly. Looking ahead, it was also important that ownership of subsoil mineral rights was vested with the national government rather than with particular Tswana tribes. So ownership of the subsoil mineral rights was vested with the National Assembly, which was the government in the National Assembly, which was a representative assembly, rather than with ownership being allocated to particular tribes within the country. And that would be important in terms of the development of the diamond industry. Why were the institutions good? Well, it seems like there's three main reasons. One reason was that there were pre-colonial institutions that were themselves relatively representative. Botswana was based around tribal organisation of Tswana tribes. The Tswana had migrated into Botswana from the southeast in the 18th century and taken over the indigenous Sana and established a Tswana tribal-based society. An important part of political organisation in that society was something called the Kuglotus, which was an assembly which all the adult males were able to participate in at regular intervals, where key political issues were discussed. So the pre-colonial political institutions involved an element of representativeness. It was also the case that there was a system of property rights. So land was collectively owned, but cattle was privately owned in pre-colonial times. And in particular, the tribal chiefs had large holdings of cattle. So some of the elements of what we think of as good institutions were already present in Botswana pre-colonisation. Second key point is that colonisation in Botswana was not as disruptive or didn't set in place new institutional structures in the same way as it did in other African nations. So British colonial rule in Botswana was fairly limited. So it was not known at that time that Botswana had the diamond resources. And so Botswana, the British government set up the Protectorate of Bechuanaland in 1885, mainly to act as a strategic buffer against German Southwest Africa and against the Boer states on the other side. So there are plans to integrate Botswana into South Africa, but that never happens. It's not to say that there are no consequences of colonisation. For example, a large part of Botswana population end up supplying cheap labour to the white population in South Africa. But there's not the same disruption to existing or creation of new institutions through British colonial rule as is the case in other parts of Africa. It also seems important to acknowledge individual agency. So in this course, talking about overall economic development, talking about broad economic forces, it's important to you sometimes step back and acknowledge that the importance of individuals in history and individual agency. And it does seem that the initial Botswanan leader, Seretse Khama, was particularly influential in directing Botswana towards being a socially coherent society through the type of institutions he created, and directing public policy to be made for the public good. So it's important to acknowledge the role of individual agency where that matters as well. Notwithstanding these points about the types of institutions, Botswana was a poor country at independence. So to the extent that it's a better off country now, that's really something that's happened through the experience after independence. So how is it that good institutions have promoted development? Well, one important point is that policy has worked in favour of the areas of economic activity in which Botswana has a comparative advantage. So the elite in the political system were the cattle-owning farming class. And so if we think of the political system as putting in place policies that are biased in a way towards the elite political class, they were putting in place policies that were actually biased in favour of the area that Botswana had a comparative advantage in. And we've seen that several times in the course, the idea that you can damage a country's economic performance by trying to bias its economic activity away from the area where it has a comparative advantage. For example, just in this lecture, we've talked about the case, for example, of procurement of agricultural products in Ghana, where there was actually a disincentive to engage in agricultural activity created by the prices being held down through compulsory procurement. That's working against the area in which your economy has a comparative advantage. Second point is that when diamonds are discovered in Botswana, good institutions have already been put in place. So remember, in the last section of the lecture, we talked about how the idea that it's the interaction of resource abundance and institutional quality that matters for whether a country benefits from its resource endowment. And so Botswana had put in place good institutions. It's got a representative government, it's got institutions for ownership of the mineral resources, diamonds, that mean that those are owned by the people in common through the National Assembly. And so that means that the resource ends up being exploited, the diamonds are exploited in a way that benefits society to a much greater extent than we might have expected if these good institutions weren't in place. The other point about institutions in Botswana is that they've prevented social dissension or provided for social cohesion. For example, by minimising the role of tribes as a basis for political organisation, for policy making, that's been a basis for introducing greater cohesion into society. By ensuring that the elite in society could be confident that they would have an ongoing role in policy making, and that was all elite groups in society, so there's a balance in who has power, that's reduced the scope for outcomes like civil war. So a series of ways in which you can think of institutions as having promoted development. There was good institutions in place that meant that mineral resources have been exploited for the benefit of society. Policies been directed towards the areas in which the Botswana economy had comparative advantage, and policies have promoted social cohesion. The other case study that I want to talk about is Mauritius, and I'm basing this case study mainly on a recent study by Jeffrey Frankel. So Mauritius is a sugar export economy. Plantation, which we know is produced efficiently with scale economies, so plantation-based economy. Mauritius has a history of slavery and ethnic tensions. It's only a very small country, small domestic market, yet it has high population density. And in fact, James Mead, the Nobel Prize winning economist, in a discussion of African prospects for development, singled out Mauritius in the 1970s with a prophecy of doom, saying that Mauritius had a whole lot of characteristics which seemed to predispose it towards being an economic failure. That it had a small market which would make it difficult to industrialise, that the history of slavery and ethnic tensions would endow it with poor institutions and perhaps civil war and so on. So Mauritius is also an economy that potentially, like Botswana, we could think of as heading towards being a poor performer. Yet, as we saw in the table at the start, that hasn't been the case. Mauritius has actually made a successful transition from being an agricultural to a manufacturing, and now to some extent to being a service economy. In case you haven't been to Mauritius, which I haven't, this is the Port Louis waterfront, which is main urban area in Mauritius. But you can get the sense of it being an island and get the sense of it being a relatively small population on the island as well from this photo. So how did Mauritius become a successful economy? Well, similar to Botswana, Jeffrey Frankel says Mauritius has followed mostly growth-enhancing policies. The growth-enhancing policies can be traced back to good institutions. So we can ask the next question, similar that we asked for Botswana, what are the good institutions? Well, Botswana has created a post-independence parliamentary system with comprehensive participation that involves representation for all ethnic groups and rural districts, and has something called a best loser system. Now, the history of Mauritius is that European colonisation began with the Dutch in 1598. The Dutch East India Company came there and started exporting ebony trees, which were there from 1634, taken over by the French in the early 18th century. The French start sugar production for export in 1744, plantation-based system with slaves. The British take over Mauritius after defeat of Napoleon in 1814. Slavery is abolished, and so what happens is that there is a system of bringing Indian indentured labour. 500,000 Indians are brought to Mauritius to provide indentured labour from 1849 to 1923. So you end up with three major population groups in Mauritius. You've got the Franco-Mauritian population, you've got a Creole population of ex-slave population, and you've got the Indian population. So potentially a recipe for ethnic tension, a recipe for dominance by one group in the political system, with all of the problems that we've described going with that in the section of the lecture on Africa after independence. Yet what Mauritius does is it creates a parliamentary system of 20 electorates. Each electorate has 3 seats, and those 3 seats go to the 3 people getting the highest level of votes. And so basically what that means is it's almost proportional representation within each electorate, that to the extent that you've got 3 evenly sized groups in each electorate, they're each going to get represented in the parliament. As well, there's a best loser system where 8 losing candidates from the election who are otherwise, whose interests, the interests they represent are otherwise seen as being unrepresented, are put into the parliament. So a deliberate attempt through the parliamentary system that was created to give a broad representation to all groups in society. Mauritius didn't establish an army, and so that hasn't been the basis for social tension in the country. And security of property rights has been well established there as well. For example, after independence, there was no, despite at one stage the Socialist Party having had this as its policy, post-independence, there's no attempt to expropriate the Franco-Mauritian sugar plantations. So both in tradition and through law, the principle of security of property rights is established. Why were the institutions good? Well, several reasons. One reason is that the institutions that existed prior to independence included representative political rights. So Britain had a system of government for the local population, which included general access to being able to sit in the assembly that existed before independence. So there was a tradition of representative political rights prior, or some tradition prior to independence. A second factor which seems especially important is the care that was taken in the preparing for independence. When you read a lot about African independence, the words rush or haste are often used. In the case of Mauritius, that wasn't the case. There was a commission called the Banwell Commission that consulted widely about what the system of government should be, and which came up with this idea of the 20 electorates with 3 seats and the best loser system as well. So it's an interesting lesson in how potentially good political institutions can come out of taking time to do the designing. A point that Frankel makes about Mauritius compared to some other places in Africa is the fact that all of the population here were immigrants. So he compares Mauritius with Fiji, and he says that he thinks one possible reason why there's been less political tension, in some ways similar history of sugar plantations and migration of Indian labour. He argues that one reason why there's very different histories of social tension is that all of the population on Mauritius were really immigrants, whereas in Fiji you have the indigenous population, and you have the indigenous population and the indigenous population seeing perhaps different rights coming from being the indigenous population compared to Mauritius, where it's, as Frankel describes, an immigrant isle. Again, important to emphasise the role of good political leadership in the aftermath of the independence as being a potentially important contributing factor. In this case, Siwasagar Ramgoolam was the first leader of Mauritius after independence, and generally regarded as having made a series of highly sensible, for example, policy decisions, such as the decision not to seek to expropriate sugar plantations. How have institutions promoted good development? Well, one way is the quality of policy making, that there's been a commitment to creating public infrastructure in Mauritius, for example, education. There's also been the creation of export processing zones, which have been highly successful in facilitating the development of textile and clothing manufacturing industry in Mauritius. These processing zones involved being allowed to get or obtain inputs for production free of tariffs which were being imposed were those imports going to other parts of Mauritius, tax breaks on producers in the export processing zone, and also really the creation of a dual labour market where minimum wage laws and other restrictions on labour were removed within the export processing zone to allow producers in that zone to compete with lower wage producers in other parts of the world. Mauritius has been highly successful in negotiating preferential access to European and US markets. So Mauritius was successful in negotiating, was able to negotiate a quota, a sugar quota with the European economic community that's turned out to be highly beneficial to it, and it's been able to negotiate conditions for supplying textiles and clothing to the United States under the multi-fibre agreement, which have been highly beneficial to it. Some studies have estimated that the rents from owning quotas to supply sugar to Europe and textiles and clothing to the US were worth 7% of Mauritian GDP in the 1980s and 4.5% in the 1990s. Mauritius has also been relatively successful at responding to adverse macroeconomic shocks. For example, adopting a flexible exchange rate system, unlike many other parts of Africa where they maintained overvalue exchange rates. The willingness to implement economic reforms in response to adverse shocks has meant that Mauritius has responded relatively well to adverse macroeconomic disturbances. It's also the case that the good institutions arguably reduced internal strife. For example, the social cohesion produced by having a representative national parliament that allows the three main ethnic groups to be represented can be argued to be a contributing factor to the social cohesion there. Although, as I've talked about, Frenkel also emphasises the potential importance of the role of all those groups as being immigrants. So that's two case studies of countries within Africa that have been successful developers. It tells us, like I said at the start, that we really need to consider each case anew when we're thinking about economic development and what's caused economic development. Having said that, though, you'll have seen that a strong lesson that comes out of these two case studies is the importance of institutions in promoting economic development. That both these countries, in a variety of ways, had historical circumstances, had geography that you might think had predisposed them to having low levels of economic development, but that by adopting good institutions, they've been able to develop successfully compared to much of the rest of Africa in the period after independence.